Long before the first cities were carved into stone, or the first kings wore crowns of gold, there was a time when humans were just wild. No fences, no borders, no written laws, just survival. This was the Paleolithic world, a place of raw instincts and relentless uncertainty. The sun was our only clock. The stars were our only map. And the earth was both home and hunter. Imagine it. A small group of early humans waking up beneath the canopy of trees. The fire that had kept them safe all night smolders quietly, reduced to glowing embers. A child stirs, yawns, and clutches a woven pouch of dried berries. Her mother eyes the forest warily, not for wonder, but for threats. Every rustle could be a predator or a rival tribe. But this was life. And for them, it wasn't terrifying. It was normal. In fact, it was the only normal they'd ever known. Prehistoric tribes lived without luxury, but not without intelligence. They knew the seasons, like we know dates on a calendar. They read the wind, the tracks in mud, the shifting bird calls, and somehow, this knowledge carried not in books, but in stories. Instincts and mimicry kept them alive for thousands of years. A single day meant hunting, gathering, watching, listening. Each person played a role. Children learned by doing, watching, imitating. There were no schools, but there was plenty of education. Meals weren't scheduled. You ate when you could, when the tribe succeeded. A missed hunt meant going to bed hungry. Not once, but for days. The wild didn't allow for weakness. But here's the twist. Community was everything. Despite the danger, the cold, the hunger, humans didn't survive alone. They couldn't. They depended on one another. That need for others is part of what made them, and us, human. So when we ask, what were we like before civilization? The answer isn't just survival. It's trust, cooperation, shared stories told in hushed tones around firelight. The last time we were wild wasn't chaotic. It was connected, and it laid the groundwork for everything that came after. Maps didn't exist. Neither did nations, flags, or frontiers. The prehistoric world was one vast, open land, defined not by politics, but by necessity, and the tribes that roamed it. They moved like rivers, flowing wherever survival demanded. Some lived in caves, others in temporary huts, or under rock shelters. Their homes weren't meant to last, just long enough to rest, eat, and recover. Then, they moved. Again and again. So how did these people know who they were? Through kinship, through shared language, gestures, rituals, and loyalties. A tribe wasn't defined by place, it was defined by people. They may not have had flags, but they had identity. It was in the scars of their hunts, the decorations etched on their tools, the way they buried their dead. It was in the markings they painted on stone walls or on their own skin. Early tribes moved constantly, but they weren't lost. Their knowledge of land, sky, and migration paths was astounding. They followed the rhythms of animals, the blossoming of plants, the rise and fall of rivers. And when another tribe appeared, that's when things got interesting. Not all meetings were hostile. In fact, many were peaceful. Tribes traded, not just goods like flint, shells, or food, but ideas, language, songs, techniques for carving, cooking, or healing. Sometimes, a tribe would take in a lone wanderer, especially if they proved useful. Other times, a disagreement over a hunting ground could lead to a skirmish. But tribal identities were fluid, not fixed. The idea of a border, something you couldn't cross, didn't yet exist. That came later. Much later, in this early world, identity wasn't tied to land. It was tied to connection. The tribe was your compass, your family, your protection, your world. And as they moved, the early humans carried not just tools and memories, but the beginnings of something deeper. The notion of belonging. Every night, after the hunt was over and the dangers of the day had faded into shadows, the tribe would gather, not just to eat, but to connect. And at the center of it all was fire. Fire didn't just keep away predators. It lit up the night and warmed the bones. But more than that, it drew people together. Here, in flickering orange light, culture was born. They told stories. Stories of hunts, of dreams, of ancestors. Stories of stars, of spirits, of things that couldn't be explained, but could be felt. These tales weren't just entertainment. They were instruction, memory, meaning. You see, prehistoric people didn't write books, but they passed down entire histories through voice and gesture. Around the fire, children learned where the waterholes were, which plants could heal, which animals to avoid. Songs were sung. Rhythms drummed on wood or bone. Dances mimicked the movements of prey or celebrated a successful hunt. This was art before galleries. Music before instruments. Theater before stages. It was also ritual. Some of the earliest evidence of ritual burials, with beads, tools, or red ochre, suggests a belief in something more. A spirit world, an afterlife, a soul. And it all began around the fire. What's fascinating is that nearly every human culture, no matter how remote, has some form of oral tradition. It's as if we're hardwired to share stories, to find meaning in the chaos of life. The fire wasn't just a physical space. It was the birthplace of identity, of language, of imagination. And from it, culture began to rise like smoke into the stars. The stereotype of prehistoric women as passive, secondary figures is not only outdated, it's wrong. Archaeology and anthropology are rewriting that story. In many ancient tribes, women held power, not through brute strength, but through knowledge, influence, and central roles in the survival of their communities. They gathered food, often contributing the majority of the daily calories. They knew which plants could cure a wound or end a life. They raised children, taught language, kept stories alive. But beyond that, some led burial sites of high-status females surrounded by tools, beads, or ceremonial items. Hint at priestesses, or respected elders. These weren't exceptions. They were part of a system where ability, not gender, often determined status. Think about it. In a world where every member had to pull their weight, there was little room for arbitrary hierarchies. A sharp-edged woman who could track prey or heal a broken leg wasn't just accepted, she was essential, and women also shaped belief. Many prehistoric carvings, like the famous Venus figurines, suggest reverence for fertility, motherhood, and the female form as sacred. Some of these figures are ancient, over 25,000 years old. Did they represent goddesses, matriarchs, creation myths? We may never know, but their presence speaks loudly. Women were central to life, and to the stories humans told about it. The wild wasn't ruled by men, or by women. It was ruled by respect, for skill, for knowledge, for life. Not every encounter between tribes ended in song and trade. Sometimes, they ended in blood. The idea of war may seem like a more civilized concept, something that came with kingdoms and empires. But the seeds of conflict were sown long before that. Why? Because resources were scarce. Food, water, shelter, territory. When survival was on the line, so was everything else. Evidence of prehistoric violence exists. Mass graves with signs of blunt trauma, arrowheads lodged in bones, skulls crushed by blows. These weren't accidents, they were battles. But war in this era looked different. There were no organized armies, no uniforms, no generals, just small groups, fighting for survival or revenge. Some skirmishes may have lasted minutes, others could have dragged on in cycles of ambush and retaliation. And sometimes, violence wasn't about resources, but about identity. A stranger seen as a threat, a long-standing grudge, a perceived insult to honor or belief. Still, it wasn't all chaos. In many cases, tribes avoided unnecessary conflict. War was costly, risky, dangerous, but it also shaped who we are. Conflict forged alliances. It created heroes. It birthed cautionary tales, and slowly, painfully, it taught humans a dark but lasting truth, that even in the wild, power could be taken by force. Long before temples and scriptures, humans looked to the sky and asked, why? Why does the sun rise and fall? Why do the stars shift? Why does the wind speak in whispers one day and scream the next? In a world full of danger and mystery, prehistoric tribes searched for meaning. And what they found wasn't science. It was spirit. They believed the world was alive. Not just animals and people, but rivers, mountains, trees, and storms. Everything had a soul, a will, a presence. This belief system, animism, was likely the first human religion. You could feel it in the silence before a storm, in the gaze of a wolf across the valley, in the cry of a newborn child. These weren't coincidences. They were messages. To make sense of it all, humans created totems, carved symbols representing animals, ancestors, or forces of nature. These weren't just art. They were guides, protectors, reminders of who the tribe was, and where they came from. Totems were passed down, painted on cave walls, worn as amulets, or raised high on wooden poles. They marked identity. They carried power, and the sky. The sky was sacred. Some tribes tracked the stars with astonishing precision. They noticed the patterns, how certain constellations aligned with the changing of seasons, the migrations of herds, or the timing of plant growth. Was it magic? No. It was observation, passed down across generations, embedded into ritual, woven into song. Over time, some forces took shape as gods. A mother goddess who gave life, a sky father who cast lightning, a trickster spirit who caused mischief. These beliefs weren't uniform. Each tribe had its own variations, its own legends. But the impulse was the same: to find order in chaos, to believe that life had purpose. And isn't that, in a way, the most human thing of all? When we imagine prehistoric relationships, we often think in extremes, primitive pairings, or free-for-all chaos. But reality was far more nuanced. Tribes weren't just survival machines. They were emotional ecosystems. Love existed, so did heartbreak, loyalty, betrayal, yearning. We know this, not because prehistoric people left behind love letters, but because they left behind patterns, in graves, in tools, in the way they cared for their young. Monogamy wasn't universal, but neither was promiscuity. Some groups likely formed long-term pair bonds. Others may have embraced fluid relationships, based on group needs or resource sharing. What's clear is this: relationships were less about rules and more about connection. Children were raised communally. An infant wasn't just the responsibility of a mother, it belonged to the tribe. Aunts, uncles, elders, all played a role. This created a sense of belonging that ran deeper than blood. It wasn't nuclear family. It was something wider, warmer, more resilient, and sex. It wasn't taboo. It was natural, sacred. Even in many cultures, fertility was celebrated, not hidden. Rituals honored the act of creation. Bodies weren't shamed. They were revered. We find carvings of pregnant figures, of lovers intertwined, of life in all its raw and sacred beauty. This wasn't vulgar. It was vital, because at its core, love was survival. Not just the act of reproduction, but the act of caring, of staying, of protecting something other than yourself. And in that, the first echoes of modern family were born. One day, somewhere in the world, someone decided not to move. They had food, water, shelter, and for the first time, they stayed. That decision changed everything. The first villages didn't rise in grandeur. They crept into existence. Small clusters of huts, fires that never went out, footpaths worn into dirt by repetition. Farming played a huge role. Once people began planting crops and domesticating animals, there was a reason to remain in one place. Grains were stored. Herds were protected. Fields were tended season after season. The shift from tribe to village was subtle but profound. Suddenly, people had possessions: storage pits, walls, baskets, ceramics, tools that didn't travel, but stayed put. New roles emerged. Not everyone had to hunt. Some wove, some shaped clay, some watched children. Others began to lead. With permanence came politics. Leaders rose, perhaps the wise, the strong, or the generous. Decisions had to be made. Disputes settled. Resources shared or defended. And with leadership came hierarchy, status, wealth, power. Some people had more, others had less. Inequality was born here, quietly. But so were art, innovation, and collaboration. Permanent homes led to more complex tools: kilns, looms, domesticated dogs, brewing, writing. Eventually the first villages were humble, but their impact was massive. They paved the way for everything we now call civilization. And yet, they also marked the end of something older. The wild freedom of the nomadic world faded. Tribes became rooted. Identity shifted. And the world would never be the same. They never meant to leave us messages, but they did. In bones buried under ash, in footprints fossilized in ancient mud, in charcoal drawings hidden in cave walls, untouched for millennia. These are the silent witnesses of prehistory. And archaeology is the language we use to listen. Each discovery, each chipped stone, each burial site, each pollen grain trapped in sediment tells a story. We've found graves of children, buried with beads and tools, proof that even the youngest were mourned. That love didn't begin with modern humanity. We've uncovered settlements where injuries were healed, broken bones that mended with care. These people didn't abandon their wounded. They helped them heal. In some caves we find handprints, not random, but deliberate. red ochre on stone, left by someone who wanted to say, I was here, ... And in others, scenes of hunts, dances, or mysterious symbols speak of rituals we may never fully understand. Tools tell us about innovation, the shift from stone to bone, from spear to bow, the rise of fishing, of weaving, of crafting needles and clothing, and DNA. It's rewriting everything. We now know ancient humans interbred with Neanderthals, that they migrated farther and faster than we ever imagined, that tribes connected across unimaginable distances. But for every answer, we uncover more questions rise. Who painted the first face? Who sang the first lullaby? What thoughts stirred behind those ancient eyes? The bones don't speak, but if you listen closely, they still whisper. In our cities of steel and glass, with calendars full of deadlines and phones that never sleep, it's easy to forget where we came from, but the echoes are still there. When you gather around a campfire with friends, when you tell a story to a child, when you feel awe at a thunderstorm or peace in a forest, that's them. That's us. The prehistoric tribes may be gone, but their lessons remain. They teach us about resilience, about adapting, not just to survive, but to thrive in brutal, changing worlds. They teach us about connection, how humans, even in the harshest times, sought community, shared knowledge, and found beauty in the act of being together. They show us that leadership isn't about dominance, it's about service, about protecting those who can't protect themselves. They remind us that belief in something greater, in each other, in the unknown, is what gives life its depth, and perhaps most importantly, they show us that everything we now call civilized began in the dirt, around a fire, in the stories whispered beneath ancient skies. We didn't start with palaces or laws or money. We started with each other, and maybe, just maybe, in remembering that we find a way forward.